Well, it's that time of year again, where I give belated reviews to all the other films I saw this year, or last year depending on when this comes out. So let's just get right into it, starting off with, and brace yourselves for this, Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba the movie Mugen Train. So Demon Slayer the movie. I saw this in a theater with a friend who was a fan of the show, and despite having no connection to this franchise prior to seeing it, it was actually pretty fun. The movie picks up where the first season's finale left off. These kids who hunt demons board a train heading towards their next mission, and on their way a demon who can control dreams infiltrates the train to try to assassinate them. It's a pretty straightforward plot, but it obviously helps if you've seen the series, since the dreams the main characters have hold a personal weight, and because it helps to have a better understanding as to how this world works. My only issue with the story is that halfway through it stops being about what they initially set up, and they introduce a completely different bad guy who kinda comes out of nowhere, so it feels like the creators took 2 3-part episodes from the series and put them together to reach feature length. The movie was basically going through the motions at that point, and I found him to be much less interesting than the dream guy. His parts in the movie had a consistent change of setting both on the train and within the character's dreams, but the fight with the second guy was largely in one dull location. That's not to say the fight itself was completely dull though, because this movie has beautiful animation throughout. The series has always been good at blending 2D and 3D elements, and it never comes off as jarring even when you can tell the difference. The cinematography used here is some of the best I've seen in animation, making for some breathtaking action scenes. So even though it's tropey and kinda dumb sometimes, I can't deny that it's extremely well made, and that for the most part it does accomplish what it sets out to do. So if this looks cool to you, then check out the show and give this a watch. Next up I saw Some Kind of Heaven. The release dates on this one are kind of weird. Some class it as a 2020 movie because of film festivals, but it did get an official wide release in 2021. So screw it, I like this movie and I want to talk about it. This is a documentary about a kind of high-class elderly home, where the residents have a bunch of fun activities to do and have all their needs met, but the members being focused on in the interviews aren't feeling very fulfilled. While the subject matter may sound dull, it manages to be a very thought-provoking and well-paced piece of art that explores themes of loneliness, internalized emotions, lacking a sense of direction in life, and how for some people the tedious emotional and social problems you feel at a younger, immature age still kinda lingers no matter how old you get. I found the people they selected to interview to be very charming and compelling to watch. It was fun to watch the contrast between their personalities, and each of them were given the perfect amount of time to shine, which was helped even more by the film's editing. I could tell a lot of forethought went into how they executed these sequences. The timing of everything was perfect, the soundtrack was great, and the way it was used felt very satisfying, and the way the visual and audio cues synced up with the dialogue made for some very clever moments. As far as documentaries go, this is probably one of the best presented ones I've ever seen. The cinematography paired with the aspect ratio makes quite literally every single shot look like a picture-perfect photograph, and it makes you feel like you're walking through an art gallery. I had a great time watching this movie, and I highly recommend it to those who love documentaries, and even people who don't. Give it a shot, it's great. Next, I saw Words Bubble Up Like Soda Pop, and it was okay. We took a chance on Netflix to watch something we hadn't seen before, and it was perfectly fine. Like, the general vibe is equivalent to a default song that you would find on any given editing software, if that makes any sense. It's about these kids who bond over the course of a summer, and that's about it. It's a really low-stakes story that just kind of coasts along casually. The animation was nice, and I laughed a couple times. Perfect background noise if you want to build a shelf or something. That's about it. That's all I have to say about this one. Not bad, but not memorable either. Moving on. Next, I saw Sword Art Online, the movie, Progressive, Aria of a Starless Night. And unlike the Demon Slayer movie, I couldn't really get into this. This was yet another movie that I was not dragged to, but invited to by a friend who watched the show. And I remember starting this series a long time ago, and it not really clicking with me, and I think I realized why after watching this movie. So basically it's about this popular VR game that a bunch of the players get stuck in because the creator of the game felt like trapping them and forcing them to survive, and they have to stay alive. 2006, starring Frankie Muniz. Because if they die in the game, they die for real. From what I can remember, this is actually a remake of the first few episodes of the first season, and unsurprisingly, translating 40 minutes worth from the show into an hour-and-a-half film led to some pretty bad pacing. The characters were kind of flat, and I wasn't really digging their relationships that much. They were definitely serviceable, but none of them really stuck out to me as anything special. And from my normie perspective, who hasn't seen past the first couple episodes of the series, the whole gamer angle is heavily underutilized here. Once it gets past the initial setup, it turns into a basic medieval-themed anime. Sure, they occasionally whip out UIs and analyze their stats every now and again, but honestly it just feels like an afterthought in the end. Kinda reminds me of Onward in that way. Even disregarding the gimmick, the movie itself is nothing to write home about. The animation definitely isn't bad and there's some really nice looking action scenes, but to unfairly compare it to Demon Slayer, for the most part, it looked more suited for a TV show than a feature-length movie. It wasn't really a frustrating experience throughout, I was decently entertained, and once again I'm not really a fan of this show, so if you are into this franchise you'll probably like it. As for everyone outside the fandom, there really isn't much of interest here, but if this does look cool to you, then just check out the first couple episodes of the show. I may not have liked it that much, but it does cover everything that happens here in a much more concise manner. And finally, I saw SpiderMan No Way Home, and it was a pretty good time. The build-up to this movie over the past year has been pretty obnoxious, to say the least, because no one would shut up about returning actors from previous franchises, so by the time those moments were revealed in the trailers and movie, I wasn't really blown away in the approach the script intended. And I wound up being more worried than hyped about how they were going to portray these characters that came from such different creative voices. So did they manage to pull it off? For the most part.
Yes.
The setup as to why these villains are coming into this universe still kind of bothers me because of how poorly thought out it was. Like, Peter messes up the spell to make everyone forget his secret identity, and Doctor Strange is like, after everything we've been through, I forget you're still a kid who makes dumb mistakes. Even though the only reason he messed up was because Doctor Strange didn't tell him how the spell worked in the first place.
I got a contract. No need to read every word, honey. It's all standard language. And initial here, and write your measurements here.
Can't some people still know?
You should have read the contract.
But I was able to get over it pretty quick because why else are any of us here? I mean, to see the movie, not existentially. Once the villains started interacting with this version of Spider-Man, it became a blast to watch from then on. Most of the callbacks they made were fairly justified and didn't get on my nerves as much as I thought they would, but I'd be lying if I said the movie didn't have explicit meme moments, like when Doc Ock says the power of the sun in the palm of my hands twice, or when Green Goblin said I'm something of a scientist myself. Moments like those hardly felt natural, and the movie would have been better without him. However, in terms of how these characters played into the story, I have to admit that the direction they ended up taking with them was pretty unique. And the way they were implemented into this universe by being brought in during their prime villainous moments in their original movies made for a fun what-if scenario, and not the kind that sucks, where they acknowledge the absurdity of each character's story without feeling mean-spirited. I'm not a fan of those Amazing Spider-Man movies at all, but even the way those characters were used in this movie made for some pretty fun and sometimes emotional moments. Venom fans, on the other hand, weren't so lucky, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But of course, the only people I was really looking forward to seeing were the Raimi characters, and I'm so glad to say that they pretty much nailed them perfectly. Apart from those previously mentioned cringy callback lines, they do feel as though they're plucked straight from those movies, and the writers built upon their personalities in a really satisfying way. The biggest issue I had with them is that they lacked the presence they had in those Raimi movies. I know that trilogy's CG hasn't aged the best, but the way they blended the practical and CG elements back then still manages to impress me to this day. And unfortunately, just like this universe's version of Spider-Man, any practical effects that might have been used behind the scenes were completely drowned out by the trademarked Marvel sheen of CGI. I get that at the end of the day, these characters are being portrayed by a different creative voice, but the overuse of CG for these modern superhero movies is unfortunately emblematic of how the Hollywood filmmaking process has changed, and how it makes me miss the impact I felt watching those old movies no matter how ridiculous the action got. I'll admit that criticism is a bit more subjective. There's definitely no shortage of cool set pieces, it's just my taste I suppose. Overall, I'm very satisfied with the final product. It had the most compelling story for this version of Spider-Man since Homecoming, and ended in a very interesting place that has me excited to see what comes next for him. So go check it out, even though you almost definitely already have.
I don't have much more to say.